Hey, you guys, welcome back to the channel. This is Jason, and today I want to talk to you guys about what I think is going to be one of the largest investment opportunities to come along in a very long time outside of tech. I'm mostly a tech investor, guys. For the most part, the investments that I hold are in mutual funds and in ETFs, but the individual stocks I tend to hold are usually in tech stocks. This is looking to be an exception, and I want to talk about why that is. We are going through what is likely to be a culturally transformative shift in terms of pharmaceuticals. Now, this has happened a couple of times before. Namely, I'll give you three examples. The birth control pill that came out in the late 1960s, which kind of heralded the sexual revolution, the advent or invention of Prozac, which became one of the most widely used drugs on the entire planet and is helping tens of millions of people out today. And Viagra, of course, probably not what you think of as transformative, but it really was, especially in terms of profits for Pfizer and a number of other companies. But the next thing to come along is actually weight loss drugs. So for the longest time, the weight loss industry has been a giant. It's been really a giant. There are a number of weight loss companies that are actually public right now. If you are invested in any one of those weight loss companies, I would urge you to reconsider that investment. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. But I did want to take the time to point out something that is in the description of this. I don't normally put like affiliate links in there other than some links to some books, but I did find a great gift for Mother's Day. It is an affiliate link, so if you click on it, I'll get a little bit, but it's basically a flower arrangement made out of Legos. Now, I got something similar for my wife last year, and my kids absolutely loved helping my wife put that together, and it's just a gift idea. Anyway, link is in the bio. Check it out if you want to, or if you don't. So, like I said, the weight loss industry has actually been really large, something in the tens of billions of dollars. And it's been that way since the 1950s and 1960s, when we saw the advent of the sort of American dream type of household, where, white picket fence, stay-at-home mother, car in the garage, that sort of thing. And really the 1920s is when you saw weight loss products take off in advertising, but you really didn't see a solid foundation for an industry until the 1950s when we started with all of these weight loss programs that were around. But if you were paying attention in the last couple of weeks, you would have seen the announcement that Jenny Craig made a few weeks ago, where they're closing something like 300 plus locations across the country because they think that there has been a generational shift in the way people are addressing weight loss. And all of this really comes down to two companies right now, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly have developed by accident, just like many great medications, many great problems are solved serendipitously, meaning by accident. And, they were going after something else, but they accidentally discovered an incredible weight loss drug. These two drugs have already sort of leaked into the collective consciousness, through celebrity usage. What I'm really talking about are weight loss drugs that were developed that are now being billed as blockbuster weight loss drugs, but they were originally developed as type 2 diabetes treatments. Okay. So in the year since Eli Lilly announced trial results showing that I don't know how to pronounce that, tirzepatide, I don't know what it is, or brand name Mounjaro, help patients drop more than 20% of their weight. Now, I can tell you that over the last year, I have dropped about 20% of my weight, about 50 pounds. Had nothing to do with any drugs that I was on, and had to do with really moderating my diet. I've always been very active. I've exercised a lot. Moderating my diet, going hungry for that first 6 weeks or so until my body adjusted to eating less, was freaking torturous. And the fact that I don't really eat everything that I want to now, and I still have to watch what I eat in order to stay underweight. And the reason I did that is because I discovered that almost everyone that I'm biologically related to has type 2 diabetes, and I dedicated myself at that point to losing weight. Now, losing weight has never worked for me before. This is the first time that I went on a diet, stuck to it, and basically have kept the weight off. And it's been more than a year at this point. I'm down to roughly 160 something pounds, down from about 215. You can look at some of my older videos and see the fat version of me. It's not quite so obvious. in those videos because my face did thin out, but not that much. But look, weight loss is very difficult. People struggle with it permanently. We all know that diets don't really work. What we do know is based on the science right now, the results, and the people that are in these studies, that they are losing somewhere between 15 and 20% of their body weight. It benefits them also by sort of the early prevention of diabetes. It helps people with type 2 diabetes treat the symptoms that they already have. And this is a big deal. But let's talk about how much of a big deal this is and how much of an opportunity this is. And this type of company is not the type of company that I normally talk about, even when I'm talking about medical stuff. I usually get really excited about things in the genomics industry. And I don't really talk about the big pharmaceutical giants like Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk and Pfizer that much. But yeah, so these two companies have developed these two type 2 diabetes treatments. One of them is Mounjaro and the other one is Ozempic. And they're already developing sort of side treatments on top of that are specifically targeted towards obesity treatment. So let's talk about what that means. Novo Nordisk sells semaglutide, which as Ozempic is an injection for type 2 diabetes, Wegovy, an injection for obesity, and Rybelsus is a pill for type 2 diabetes. Um, Eli Lilly only sells Mounjaro as an injection of type 2 diabetes, but they're working on a couple of different drugs that look like they're going to be approved relatively quickly. So these are the companies right here. Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk. There's basically 5 of these that are either approved or only one of them is not approved yet. But these are already on the market and they're gaining traction. They work by significantly bettering lowering blood sugar and promoting weight loss than any medicine that's worked before. Basically, most medicines that worked before were really targeted at amping up. They were basically targeted at amping up your metabolism by working essentially like amphetamines do. This works through an entirely different process, which basically blocks your body from allowing sugar, or basically allows sugar to enter your cells and to be processed. So these drugs appear to be safe for now. They do have significant side effects, and they look to be extremely efficient. Patients of Eli Lilly's drug lost on average 22.5% of their body weight, while patients on the Novo drug lost about 14.9% of their body weight in a separate trial. By comparison, older obesity drugs cut the weight by about 7.4%. So they're already on the market. Mounjaro, Ozempic, and Wegovy and Rybelsus are already on the market, but high demand has kept them in short supply. High demand has kept them in short supply for people who really need it, who have type 2 diabetes and are not just taking it for obesity. We all have probably heard that Elon Musk may actually be on Ozempic. I don't know that that's true more than anyone else does. I assume that his medical stuff is kept private. There are competitors coming out, though. This is something that everyone is going to be on that everybody's going to be on this bandwagon as soon as they can. But analysts are thinking that obesity drug sales are likely to hit $30 billion a year by 2030. And that number doesn't include people who are taking it for type 2 diabetes. This is going to be a very, very significant market, and it's going to be very substantial in terms of the bottom lines for many of these pharmaceutical companies that are out there. And let's talk about this. At an investment conference earlier this year, Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla said that his company expects the combined obesity and type 2 diabetes market for drugs in this category to hit $90 billion globally. That's an annual amount by 2030. This kind of estimate is supported by the extremely widespread nature of two conditions. According to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, 41.9% of American adults are obese and 1 in 10 have diabetes. And let me tell you that at my age right now, almost 50, this is the first time in my since childhood that I have not qualified as obese. You know, at my height, if I weigh more than like 185 pounds, I qualify as obese. I'm well below that now. That is the first time, at least in my adult life, probably since junior high, that I have been considered not obese. So these medicines, though, they're not curatives. They just help you lose weight. And it also means that the patients are going to be on them for a very, very long time, which means that the ongoing usage potential for clients who start taking these drugs is absolutely enormous. And if you recognize the problems with dieting and you recognize the problems with keeping weight off, you can see how this market could be huge. So Mounjaro and both of its diabetes and obesity formulations, a couple of folks who are analysts, particularly Jeff Meacham of B of A Securities, thinks that there may be a market of up to $100 billion a year just for Mounjaro. More modest estimates put that at around $40 billion a year. So right now, the drugs cost about $1,000 a month. Of course, this is going to depend on dosing. It's going to depend on what it's for, and it's going to depend on who's paying for it. In a lot of cases, because patients have type 2 diabetes, it's going to be insurance companies that are paying for it. In terms of medically threatening obesity, it's probably going to be medical companies paying for it too, but I don't know. Let me see here. You know what? I haven't even thought that far ahead, Chris, in terms of who it's going to be bullish for, but it may be bullish for fast food restaurants. And that's something I haven't even considered. So Catherine, if you haven't followed my live streams very often, like I'm actually a licensed professional in the industry, so I don't give buy, sell, or hold recommendations on my channel. I talk about companies and technologies that I think are really cool, and I tell you to go think about it and do your own research and that sort of thing. But I will tell you one thing: Eli Lilly is something that I already have in my portfolio as an individual holding. It's kind of a leftover from where when I purchased it before. And I will probably be purchasing more because of these studies that have recently come out on these obesity drugs. So so diabetes is not really affected by selection, by any sort of selection process in terms of genetics, meaning that if you think about selection by or evolution by natural selection, it would seem that a deadly disease like diabetes should die out. The problem is that it's not really subject to selection because the onset of symptoms actually comes on well after the point that you are generally reproducing, meaning that you're going to get married, be attractive, and have kids long before the onset of diabetes. Diabetes usually onsets sometimes between your late 30s and your early 60s, with a large concentration of people beginning to experience the symptoms of type 2 diabetes in their early 50s. So that is kind of what I'm saying. There's not a natural selection mechanism that is going to prevent people from diabetes from passing on those genes. And a large portion of that does seem to be genetic. Like I know tons of people that have great diets and that are thin who have type 2 diabetes. It's particularly prevalent in countries like Japan and Korea because of the high rice content in their diet. And these people are thin, they're in good shape, they walk all the time, and still they suffer from diabetes. Diabetes is just one of those diseases that doesn't pop up until we're kind of beyond our natural caveman style life expectancy, meaning there are tons of diseases that are going to stick around with humanity because they don't develop till after age 40. And in the past, you would have been dead or at least not producing by age 40. So drug company, invest in drug medical companies before it's so high risk. The problem is tell 666-999, not the problem, but the great thing is 4 out of these 5 drugs have already been approved. Some of them have already been on the market for about 5 years. And we're really looking at the market for these drugs growing as more and more people are becoming aware of them. Like I heard my son the other day humming the theme song for Ozempic in the car on the way to school. Their marketing is actually top notch for this. I see Tell 666-999. Thank you so much for the super sticker. I haven't gotten a lot of these recently, so I really appreciate it when I do. So thank you very much. And no thoughts on STKH at this point. I'll have to take a look at that at some point. Like and subscribe. Thank you so much, Shoeless Joe. I usually get kind of my regulars on here who watch my live streams. I'm not sure how many new people do this show, how many new people watch. In the UK, where we live, we have the NHS, and yes, it's paid for with taxpayer money, but getting sick in the US costs way too much. Man, I pay close to $1,400 or $1,500 a month for medical insurance. and I just got a bill for $2,500 for some tests that I had run back in January. So yeah, we pay a lot for medical insurance here in the U.S. and most people who are in the U.S. are so heavily propagandized they don't realize that not only are we paying more for medical care, we're actually getting second tier poor quality medical care as well. It's medical care essentially provided with the lowest bidder, and it's really something that I wish we could solve, but we're not going to solve it on a state by state basis. It's going to be done on a national basis. And when that happens, yeah. So I've been, with NHS, if I'm sick, I don't get a bill at the end of it. So I've been fortunate or unfortunate enough to experience medical care in Belgium, France, Israel, and Japan, each of which have very different systems of universal health care. All of them were shockingly inexpensive to get that healthcare, and all of it was better quality healthcare than I receive in the United States. So that is about $1,500 for the family, and it's actually considered what's called a high deductible a high deductible policy, which means I'm able to use a health savings account. So at least the $2,500 that I'm paying is going to be tax deductible. But yeah, it's really expensive for a family. As a self-employed person, and my income is I don't make a ton of money off this channel, guys. In fact, very little, and I do this mostly for fun. This is why I'm going to start kind of promoting some links in the descriptions, because I need to make enough money off of this to kind of justify my fun here. Otherwise, my wife's going to start bugging me to do something else. But yeah, so my income's over a certain threshold, which means that I pay the full price for medical insurance. It is it's somewhere between $1,400 and $1,500 a month. My annual deductible, I think, is $6,500. My maximum out of pocket annually is like right around $30,000 for the family. So if something bad happens to more than one person in my family, I am out $30,000 for the year. And if it happens 2 years in a row, we start to become in financial trouble here. Surely it's a system that's begging for some kind of disruption. Well, the majority of people in the United States who do have medical insurance have it through their employer, and are not aware of how much it's actually costing their employer. Although that information is actually available to you on your W-2. Your W-2 has a line on it. I think it's 18B. I'm not sure what the actual line is on the W-2 anymore. I think it is 18B though. You'll see a number there if you have a family plan, probably somewhere between $18,000 and $26,000 a year. Regardless of what you're paying on your for your medical insurance, that other line in there is what your company pays for medical insurance per year. The last time that I worked for a Fortune 500 company, I was paying something like $600 a month for my medical insurance through my employer. My employer, on the other hand, was paying close to $20,000 a year on top of that. So the employer is bearing the majority of costs for medical insurance. You realize what the entire cost for medical insurance is when you leave that company and have to go on COBRA, which is a way to extend your employer's medical insurance after you get fired or laid off or quit your job. And people are always shocked that it's close to $2,000 a month. And it is absolutely insane how much we pay for medical insurance. There's the series of middlemen that are standing between you and your doctor in order to get effective care, and they all take a bite out of the system. And it's absolutely incredible. Like everyone I know who has seen sort of the under the hood in terms of medical billing will tell me the same thing. It's just a system that's rife with inefficiencies and corruption, and that's one of the main reasons why that we have such expensive medical care. You look at the Japanese system, which is actually not set up entirely differently than Obamacare is. It's just the nature of the companies are set up differently. Their profit motive is a lot less strong in that country because of how they set up their companies. But the system in Japan is set up remarkably similarly to the system in the United States, and they spend something like a third of what we do on medical care. There are other factors that go into that too, of course, meaning that population is just generally a bit healthier. But they do live longer, which costs more in the long run as well. When you have a population that's older with greater life expectancy, your medical system is going to be more expensive. And so, yeah, we are, and I think there's a lot of money to be made in medical care. This is one of the reasons why I'm very excited about these two drugs in particular. And it's not that I'm that excited because they're brand new drugs. They're not. They've been on the market for 4 or 5 years. It's just that they're starting to bubble up they're starting to bubble up in collective consciousness, and it really has less to do with type 2 diabetes and more to do with the celebrities that are using it for weight loss. And so the biggest risk for these companies, though, is that the trial is designed to prove that these drugs lower rates of stroke and heart attack in patients without diabetes. In that case, the insurance coverage and obesity indications would remain limited if the drugs are not proven to lower rates of stroke in in patients without diabetes. Okay. So yes, it may cause them to lose weight. And I think that alone would probably cause them to have lower rates of stroke and heart attacks. But that portion of the equation here is not actually proven through trials yet. The drugs are still going to be pretty big sellers, but not on the scale of everyone is thinking if they don't get FDA approval for obesity treatments, because then they wouldn't be paid for by Medicare or by other insurance companies. There are other less obvious threats. The one is the impact of Medicare price negotiations, which are set to go into effect in 2026. And this is probably one of the greatest benefits of the poorly named Inflation Reduction Act. Number one was some of the economic things that were done in the Inflation Reduction Act. Number two is Medicare's prescription drug program. Medicare is actually going to be able to negotiate with healthcare providers to cover those costs, meaning that they actually didn't have the ability to negotiate those costs before. No one knows how negotiation is going to play out, but it's possible that lower Medicare prices for Ozempic could impact the prices Eli Lilly can fetch for its competitive drug. So this author who wrote this article that I'm kind of paraphrasing as I go through it, though, I don't know if he did his research on Prozac. At one point, Prozac was darn near, and Prozac was another one of those drugs that kind of had a transformational effect on Western European and society in the United States. And I know it's sold worldwide, but it really had this transformational effect in Western Europe, where many people suffer from depression. By the time year 2001 rolled around, they had lost their patent protection. I think it was introduced in 1984. By the time 2001 rolled around, they lost their patent protection on that. They lost exclusivity, just like Pfizer's lost exclusivity on Viagra right now, and they end up basically giving away this treatment almost for free. And they were still making hundreds of millions of dollars, not billions anymore, but hundreds of millions. So this is one of the things that's kind of exciting for these companies, is that I think Pfizer lost exclusivity for Viagra in 2017. And we've seen revenues for Viagra go from about $2 billion as a share of Pfizer's revenue down to about $500 million. But now they level off at about $500 million. So, I think this is and basically that $500 million looks to be constant for a very long time, even though there's plenty of generics and competition in that space. Now you still have another 13 or 14 years of patent exclusivity with these drugs that are being produced by Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk. Although I would say that these patents are probably more easily circumvented than ones for Prozac were in the past. Not necessarily Viagra, but definitely for Prozac. And I think that we're going to see competition relatively quickly. But this is a really giant addressable market, somewhere between 90 and $100 billion a year between just type 2 diabetes treatments and obesity treatments. So, yep. Final question, Jason, for me. As always, I really appreciate your thoughts. The interest rate rise announced, good or bad thing? Actually, I think it may be a bad thing at this point. So I was all for killing inflation as it reared its head. And I knew that it was going to cause some issues with banks. If we have elevated interest rates through 2024 into 2025, when we start to see about $1.5 trillion of commercial loans come due and have to be refinanced, then we're actually going to see a really giant banking crisis at that point. So the fact that they've announced or semi-announced kind of a pause, they basically kind of hinted that there's going to be a pause after this raise to 5.25%. And So Sheila's Joe just made a funny comment. But the problem is that it really affects the value of bonds that are already on portfolios of banks, meaning that every time interest rates rise, the value of the existing bonds is going to drop. And that's going to have to cause them to revalue things that are on their balance sheet. And that's going to appear that they are in greater trouble. So that quarter point interest rate may have actually pushed a few more banks into troubled territory. So I saw an article today saying that like up to 170 banks might fail. That's not going to happen, folks. Not in this year. That is 170 banks failed a sort of stress test, not one that was designed by the Fed, but another type of stress test. I went through and read the article. The headline was really misleading. I'm still saying that the number of banks that go under this year is likely to be under 10. We are likely to see more in the way of consolidation this time around with a possible mild recession than we are going to see collapse. We're going to see an orderly sale of bank assets, and we're going to see more in terms of mergers and larger banks assuming the risks that smaller banks have taken on, and they can afford to absorb some of that risk. But let's remember, even in the midst of the banking crisis in 2008, that the banks that ended up buying all of these collateralized debt obligations, these mortgage-backed securities, they actually ended up doing very, very well on those securities based on the fact that they bought them at a massive, massive discount and assumed the risk for those portfolios. They actually did really well. But it was only the banks that were well capitalized enough to do that. The banking industry since then is very, very different. You have less in the way of that systematic risk based on what folks have assumed on their portfolio in terms of home loans, and now that is more shifted to commercial loans. What is happening now with commercial loans and commercial lines of credit is not the overextension of credit to these folks, although there has been some of that. Don't get me wrong. It has mostly to do with the changing nature of office work. We are using about 50% of the office space that we used in our economy prior to 2020, prior to the pandemic. That's what's really happening. When these construction loans and these commercial loans come due in 2024 and 2025, what we're going to see is that many of these companies, based on revenues, are not going to qualify to refinance those loans under good conditions. They're going to be paying a lot more in the way of interest, or they're going to have to liquidate their operations and sell to someone. So, yeah. Shoeless Joe says Viagra has competition now from Cialis, or a friend told me. Yeah, very, very funny, but actually very true. So in 2017, Cialis, I believe, actually came out before that. They weren't considered because the medicine works under differently. I think that they actually came out before 2017. I'm not sure about that. But in terms of actually using Viagra's formula, meaning you can just copy it now without paying a licensing fee, that ended in 2017, and that's one of the things that's caused the revenue from Viagra to be about 25% of what it was before. In fact, we can look at revenues here. In 2012, they hit a peak at about $2 billion a year. 2017, you saw a drop from $1.5 billion down to 1.2, and now it's at $497 billion a year in revenues, and that looks flat going into this year. That was by 2019. I imagine that because of the lockdowns, there was probably a spike in demand in 2020. Are shorters adding to banking problems? So I'm always reluctant to blame shorters on anything, right? Just because in a lot of cases there aren't enough of them really to swing the market. In this case, there might be, but stock price doesn't have all that much to do with runs on the bank or investor confidence in the bank, meaning do they have enough money to pay on their obligations? It can make things worse for the stock price, but not necessarily materially for the business. Take example for like SoFi, for example. I don't really care what their stock price is right now. Yes, I care that they've dropped from 20 something dollars a share down to $4.90 a share. But it tells me nothing about the actual health of the business. Their results have been nothing but stellar since the day they went public. They've been improving their business inching closer to profitability, shoring up their balance sheet, adding lines of business and diversifying their income streams, and yet their stock has continued to drop. Eventually, though, the stock price is going to catch up to fundamentals, and we'll revert back to how the market values that stock. The thing with banks, though, is that you're seeing in a lot of cases, there were a lot of banks in 2008 that were well capitalized. Particularly, I'm thinking of Union Bank in particular. They were well capitalized. They basically only had like 4,400 home loans on the books. The majority of their business was commercial at the time, and this is a large regional bank that was. They were called Union Bank of California before, but they were located in Washington, Oregon, and California. A really large regional bank with hundreds of billions of dollars on deposit, and their stock price suffered horribly during the banking crisis, and yet there was no material threat to the bank at that point. They basically had nothing to do with everything that was going on with the rest of banking because they weren't engaged in doing a ton of home loans. That's just not the line of business. They saw home loans, and this is really weird. Even though they sell home loans, they saw home loans as an enormous risk because of the 30-year payback period. So they would typically issue those loans and turn around and sell them as quickly as possible to get them off the balance sheet. And not all banks were doing that. A lot of banks were buying mortgage-backed securities in the secondary market and putting those on the balance sheet and using something called mark-to-market to sort of inflate it wasn't really inflating the value of their balance sheet. It was just misallocated to begin with. So their stock dropped like a rock, and a Japanese banking company, I forget the name of the bank. Oh, Mitsubishi Bank was able to come in and buy them at a premium from the share price. That was right about where the price was before the banking crisis started. I think I remember we all got bought out at something like $52 a share, $54 a share, something like that. And right before they announced it, it had dropped down to like $34 a share. So that was a huge benefit to me in particular, right during the middle of 2008 when everything was falling apart, is that this tender offer had been made and then the crisis really started right after that. But the reality is they weren't affected by that. And there's going to be a lot of banks that are in that boat, a lot of banks. And you would need to be a bit more diligent about looking at what the bank holds on their in their investment portfolio to understand whether or not a bank is a good risk or not. Like, for example, I don't think I'd touch anything that was concentrated in commercial real estate in New York or in San Francisco or Chicago, Houston, or Dallas right now. We are looking at places where those economies are, in Austin as well. We're looking at places where commercial real estate in those places is likely to suffer an apocalypse here in the very near future, as most people are working from home at least part-time. And based on what we know from actual office usage statistics, people use those access cards to swipe in and out of a building. We know that office usage is only 50% of what it was in 2019. And it's actually gone up quite a bit. It was only like 30% 2 years ago or something like that. But yeah, so this is a big change that's happening all across the industry. And the banking crisis, as it was 2 months ago, is probably over. And that was done for that occurred for very, very specific reasons related to venture dollars that were stored on the books there. The next crisis is going to be in commercial real estate and all of these commercial loans, 1.5 trillion that are coming due in the next year and a half to 2 years. But yeah. So anyway, I did want to talk about the banking crisis as well. And I did want to talk about, of course, PacWest, Western Alliance Bank plunge, testing predictions that the worst of the crisis is over. I'm a bit surprised to see that the agreement between, and I think PacWest and TD Bank collapsed. We also have a trading halt because their bank was packaged up and sold off. I made a prediction right after that. I think I made it actually on my YouTube community here, or at least in my Patreon group. I made a prediction right when the first bank went under, Silicon Valley Bank, that First Republic Bank was going to end up being owned by JP Morgan, and that actually came true. I think I predicted it was going to happen within 10 days. That part didn't come true, but they are owned by JP Morgan right now. On paper, if you have the ability to cover a deposit run right now, what they have in terms of investments actually looks pretty good if you have a long enough time horizon. But with a bank run, the First Republic Bank just didn't have a long enough time horizon. If you're looking at taking advantage of the banking crisis right now, you want to be looking at the better capitalized players, the ones that were with deposits over $250 billion or so, who were subject to all of that regulation. The banks between, say, $50 billion and $250 billion were not subject to a ton of regulation. We don't know exactly what they're doing. And you're going to have to do a lot more due diligence in understanding whether or not those are going to be a good investment. So the investment that I followed before that is now likely in big trouble is going to be Moneyline. And I'll talk more about that. So in the future, as I have more clarity on their quarterly results, but they're going to have a very hard time raising money. It just got harder with the reverse split that they had. And they may be able to pull off a nano dimension where they did a reverse split and 6 months later, for some reason, they've got tons of hype and they're able to do secondary offerings again. But I doubt that is going to happen unless they hit profitability really quickly. And they just had a horrible last quarter. So I don't believe that's going to happen. So, so currently hoarding cash. For me, cash is king, rightly or wrongly. So might actually be the time to defray some of the cost of holding cash, because there's a cost to holding cash right now, and that is inflation. Where you are in the UK, I think you're losing somewhere between 9 and 11% of your purchasing power annually simply by holding cash. Time deposits of some sort, like a CD, might be the right thing for you to do, or it might not. Or you might want to just set aside enough to cover emergencies and say, hey, this is now looking at a long-term investment. So let me see here. Do you think Upstart will survive the downturn? They're now holding more loans on the books, I believe. So Upstart is going through kind of a radical cost-cutting program right now. And I think that their next earnings is probably going to look better on the basis of cost-cutting. Their cost of capital has gone way up. And especially in comparison to some other companies, if they're holding more loans on their books, they're not doing that just to generate the interest income. They're doing that because the market for those types of loans, the unsecured loans, has softened a little bit. So investors want more seasoned loans to be put. I mean, seasoned loans meaning people that have paid for a year or two on those loans. And they want those to be more seasoned, packaged up in these collateralized debt obligations or asset-backed securities, right? These are really asset-backed securities. So they're over collateralized to the tune of like 30% in a lot of cases. So right now they're holding onto those just so they can put more seasoned loans in a portfolio. The issue is that if interest rates have started to slow, or interest rates are not going up anymore, basically everyone that was offering really high interest rates is going to stop for deposits. They're going to stop offering, or at least increasing those interest rates. Lending rates are going to remain relatively high, and we're going to see a spread now that we haven't seen a spread between deposit rates and lending rates, this good for a very, very long time. We're going to see that stick for a while, and we're going to see an enormous increase in interest income for banks. We are right at the point where earnings for banks are just going to get better and better and better and better based on interest income. And so there's a couple of reasons why I think Upstart might survive. Although in my mind, their chances of bankruptcy have increased rather greatly since the beginning of the year. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of the collapse in that asset-backed security market. They absolutely have to sell their securities in order to raise money to make more loans. So now they've tightened up their lending requirements. Their cheap source of capital has dried up, meaning they can't just go to banks to lend them basically 0% loans, or really low interest loans to turn around and loan that on a longer term, higher risk basis for a larger amount of interest. So they're going to be dependent on asset sales, and interest income for the most part in order to continue their business. I think that we're going to see a really negative impact on their earnings once we factor out all of the cost savings they're doing by reducing their labor expenses. We're going to see a really negative impact for a couple of quarters. How many quarters can they survive? What does their cash position actually look like? They aren't a bank, right? And this is one of the things that SoFi is doing right now is that they are shoring up their cash position. They've added $1 billion onto their balance sheet, basically just as a buffer against bad times ahead. And I'm not talking about the deposit base in their bank. I think they have something like 13 or 14 billion dollars on deposit in their bank. That still makes them a small bank at this point, but they are rapidly growing. Most of that is growing because of direct deposits that are set up by their members. But yeah, Upstart has a number of challenges, and I think that their chances of survival have decreased. Although I'm not quite negative on their chances of survival, I think their chances have decreased. So, okay. The only reason that I would have known that there is a coronation going on in Britain sometime soon, I don't know when it's going on, is because NPR did a special on it. And I know that most Americans actually care, or not most, but many, many Americans actually care about the coronation that's going to cost $150 billion or something ridiculous like that. That number had to be wrong. It's not going to cost 150 billion, maybe 150 million. I don't know. But that's the number that I heard. I'm sure I heard it wrong. I don't care about it, but a lot of Americans do. So I am paying attention with what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. I will say that the predictions I've made on that have been wrong in a lot of cases. What it looks like to me is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be not what we expect. It's not going to be as large or as impactful as we expect, but it's not going to be the absolute dud that Russia's spring offensive was. Russia's spring offensive was an absolute dud. They've essentially captured another 0.2% of Ukrainian soil since they began their offensive in February. They may end up capturing Bakhmut at this point. It doesn't matter. It's just rubble. But the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which has to be aimed at disrupting supplies into Crimea, has to be either going for Melitopol or for Mariupol. I just don't see it going any other way. It's got to be to one of those places because of railway junctions, and at Melitopol because of their port. And that would be a great place to allow Ukraine to put more waterborne drones in the water to control some access to the Sea of Azov and maybe to attack the Kerch Bridge. So I think that the spring offensive is going to be aimed at one of those two. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Ukraine does achieve these wildly optimistic results. And I think that their strategy of timing their spring counteroffensive or their summer counteroffensive extremely late, so there can't be a later on counteroffensive is in the same season, I think is very smart. And that's one of the reasons why it worked so well in last August. I don't think, though, that it's going to be quite as successful this time around, largely because now I'm not paying that much attention to the intelligence leak that came out just recently. I'm not sure that a large part of that intelligence leak wasn't a disinformation campaign on the part of Ukraine and the United States. I'm sure that the leak was entirely. I'm sure that this Jack Teixeira guy, he's going to spend a very, very long time in prison, along with a couple of his relatives. I think that was entirely nefariously done, but I think the information that he may have been given to be released may have been part of a disinformation campaign, and we don't know exactly what Ukraine has. I do know that everyone's excited about these 300 something tanks that they've received, but let's remember it's like 8 different models of tanks, each with different requirements for maintenance, ammunition, and logistics. So I'm not sure how much of a deal they're going to make on a big deal they're going to make on the battlefield. That remains to be seen. So I don't know anything about the minting of $1 trillion coin. This came up a couple of years ago as well, like minting these coins a couple of years ago, and I didn't pay too much of attention to it now. And I just saw a headline of an article recently on it today, but I wasn't really paying attention to it. I haven't gotten to it yet. I was really excited about Pfizer, or not Pfizer, but Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly today, and really excited to talk about them. I could talk more on the Ukraine situation and how that's going to affect the economy, um, and what's going to happen in the future if Ukraine does manage to survive. I think that's a very, very interesting subject. It may not all be all that impactful for the people that are watching, though. That's the thing that I always want to. Actually, what am I talking about? I just talk about what I want to talk about most of the time, and don't really pay attention to what an audience would like to talk about, which is probably why I don't have that many followers on my account. So I should probably pay a little bit more attention to that. But yeah, so if you have any specific questions about Ukraine, Russia, and how that's going to relate economically, I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to engage on that on a geopolitical level as well. I generally don't criticize foreign democracies at all. Your business is your business, and our business is shamefully our business here in the United States. But like, I'm not going to comment on elections in England or your leader. I'm sorry, in Great Britain, or your leaders over there, because you're a democracy and you chose them, and that's your thing. But yeah, I'll comment all day long on dictatorships. Anyway, I am going to go ahead and get off this live stream today. I'll be back on Monday, and I'm going to be taking a deeper look at some opportunities that we're going to have here in the near future. I'll say, yeah. So even if the coronation costs 150 million, that's a drop in what U.S. is spending on Ukraine. So here's the thing, though. What we're spending in Ukraine is a damn good investment. So the United States has an enormous military budget, something like $800 million a year that we spend on a military that lately hasn't been doing very much. And we spend $800 a year, $1 billion a year on a military where I can't really show you results for that investment in a lot of cases. This is the case, though, where we've taken 5% of our military budget. We gave them an anti-tank platform that first came out in 1992 or 93, I think. And we gave them an anti-aircraft platform that first came out in 1982 or 84, somewhere between that time period, and was modernized about 1990, right? So those are really old technologies. We don't actually give money directly in terms of foreign aid. That's kind of a misnomer, or that's kind of a misconception that people have, that we're just going over there with bales of cash like we did in Iraq and dropping it off to people in Ukraine. We don't typically do that. When we did that in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was specifically for buying loyalty of warlords. But typically when we give military aid or economic aid to a country, it doesn't actually go directly to the government. It goes to non-governmental organizations, or it comes in the form of gifts of equipment, like our Lend-Lease program, right? Like we did for Great Britain during World War II, and for coincidentally the Soviet Empire, or the Soviet Union during World War II, our Lend-Lease program, where we give you equipment, right? So we are looking at about 5% of our military budget, really using things that we don't use anymore, gifting them to Ukraine, and they have destroyed about half of the combat capability of the second best army on the planet, which is not the second best army in the planet. They're barely the second best army in Ukraine at this point. I would consider that a really good investment. But let's remember, though, I'm also on the side of the United States cutting its military budget by a significant amount, a vast amount. I do think in the long run, it's a giant waste of money for a lot of reasons. Like we've interfered enough in the United States, or in the world. It's time for us to withdraw from foreign military bases, bring our boys, our men and women home, and to pay attention to things here. So let me see here. Hi, Jay. Long time. What do you think about how the market is swallowing what Powell said, since the market got no pause, no cuts? Market did not expect a pause or a cut. In fact, that was pretty clear from the betting data that was going on, is that it was like a couple of days, it was still around 52% that people were planning on, 52% of the market was planning on a quarter point rise, right? And no one was counting on a cut at that time period. I wasn't counting on a cut. I did hear that for some non-financial people, Like people that were just hanging out in my gym talking about the Federal Reserve, saying, "Oh, there's probably going to be a cut this meeting," and I didn't interject and say anything like I normally would because I'm trying to be less of a jerk these days. And no, there was nobody professional that thought that the Federal Reserve was going to cut interest rates for two reasons. Like the Federal Reserve is data driven, and all of that data is delayed by a month. So by the time the Federal Reserve starts to cut interest rates, it's already a little bit too late. We're probably heading into recession. Okay. So, and that's just the nature of the beast. Like they're data driven. The data they collect is always at least 30 days behind, maybe even more. So, so do you think that the case for SoFi going to Latin America has now increased with competition from Apple looming? Well, I think SoFi's their plan all for years has been to go into Latin America, and that has to do, with their acquisition of Technisys and Galileo, which have a strong presence in Latin America. The acquisition of the Technisys platform wasn't just about having a great platform here in the United States; it was about exploiting a fast-growing market. In terms of when you go to Latin America. Americans don't really travel very much, but I like to travel a lot, and I do business with people from Latin America all the time. Latin America, in the United States, they have a really warped view of how modern Latin America is. It's far more modern than people think. They have far more conveniences and electronics than most Americans think. But in terms of banking, I will say that they are very, very primitive. And there's just a lot of room to make improvements. And every company is thinking about going into Latin America. Every company, because there's just so much improvement to be made. Like so many improvements to be made in Latin America, and there's going to be money to be made for a generation improving banking. So I think it's going to be very exciting. So Vane, haven't seen you on my live streams for a while. Thanks for the comment earlier, and thank you so much for the super sticker. Like I said, I haven't been getting many of these lately, but it's been a lot of fun to get these. So yeah, I am going to take off today, guys. I want to rest a little bit before I have to go in and teach jiu-jitsu classes tonight. And I will see you guys on Monday. Thank you very much and have a nice weekend.